It began with a subtle unease, a gnawing sensation that someone was always watching. If I'd known what was coming, I would have trusted that feeling. But hindsight, they say, is always cruelly clear. CRAIGSLIST had always been a convenience for me, a tool to sell furniture, electronics, or clothes and snag a good deal here and there. As a woman, I stayed cautious. I'd heard my share of horror stories about sketchy buyers and eerie encounters, but my experiences had been mundane at worst. A few weird buyers had made me uneasy, but nothing that lingered. Until now. One night, while aimlessly browsing CRAIGSLIST, I stumbled across the Missed Connections page, a mix of humor and human desperation. People posted about fleeting encounters, hoping their message would reach the stranger who'd caught their eye. It was amusing, if not a little voyeuristic. But that evening, one post wiped the smile off my face. The title was simple. "Hello," the message read, "you should really pay more attention when people are watching you. It can hurt someone's feelings when they're ignored. You're blonde and petite, and I like watching you pick out your groceries." My stomach twisted as I reread the words. I was blonde, petite, and yes, I'd been grocery shopping the day before. Could it be about me? I tried to brush it off. Surely this was coincidence. There were plenty of blondes in my town. To shake off the chill, I kept scrolling, distracting myself with funny posts until I logged off. But that message lingered, a quiet itch in the back of my mind. A week later, life went on as usual. The unsettling post was just a memory, buried under the routine of work and errands. One afternoon, I returned to my usual grocery store, armed with a list and a goal to get in and out as quickly as possible. I wandered through the aisles, absent-mindedly tossing items into my cart. The store wasn't busy, and I paid little attention to the people around me. Then it happened, a prickling at the back of my neck, like eyes boring into me. I glanced up, and there he was. A man stood at the far end of the aisle, his gaze locked onto me. He was short, overweight, and middle-aged, with features partially obscured by a mask. Yet his stare was unmistakable. Cold, penetrating, and chillingly deliberate. I looked away quickly, my pulse quickening. Maybe he wasn't looking at me, but when I chanced another glance, he hadn't moved. His eyes hadn't wavered. A wave of nausea hit me. I grabbed the remaining items from my list without thinking, my only focus on leaving as quickly as possible. At the checkout, I avoided looking back, fearing I'd see him again. When I finally stepped into the parking lot, relief was short-lived. I caught sight of him, trailing me from a distance. My pace quickened, heart pounding as I fumbled with my keys. He slowed as I reached my car, standing still, watching. I drove off with shaking hands, his image seared into my memory. That night, my unease turned to dread. Browsing CRAIGSLIST again, I couldn't resist checking the Missed Connections page. A new post caught my eye. "Nice seeing you." The message read, "I love watching you in the grocery store, but it was really rude of you to run away from me in the parking lot. I just want you to love me." The room spun as I reread the words. My suspicions were confirmed. The man in the grocery store had written this. He'd been watching me, following me, and now he was leaving a digital trail. Terror gave way to anger. Against my better judgment, I replied to the post, "Leave me alone, I'm calling the police." The response came almost immediately. "I was waiting for you to reply. It's so good to finally talk to you. Now we can be together." My stomach churned. I fired back a warning, demanding he stop contacting me, and flagged the post. But deep down, I knew this wouldn't end here. That night, sleep eluded me. Around 2 a.m., my phone buzzed with an email notification. It was from him. My hands trembled as I opened it. Attached was a photo of me in my kitchen. My blood ran cold. The clothes I wore in the photo were the same ones I had on at that very moment. He was outside. Before I could process the horror, there was a knock at the living room window. A voice followed, muffled but unmistakable. "Let me in. We can finally be together." My instincts took over. I bolted into the bathroom, locking the door behind me. My hands shook as I dialed 911. The operator's calm voice tried to steady my frantic breathing, but then I heard it, the sound of glass shattering downstairs. The operator's voice urged me to stay on the line, but panic consumed me. My house, my sanctuary, was no longer safe. I pressed my ear to the bathroom door, straining to hear his movements. Footsteps echoed on the stairs. Each creak was a countdown to him finding me. Tears streamed down my face as I prayed the police would arrive in time. Then came the pounding. He was at the bathroom door, slamming against it with a force that made the hinges groan. "Open up," he bellowed. Just as I thought the door would give way, distant sirens pierced the night. The pounding stopped. I heard him retreat, his footsteps fading as the sound of police cars grew louder. When the officers arrived, the man was gone. They found broken glass and muddy footprints, but no sign of him. I recounted everything: the CRAIGSLIST posts, the grocery store, the photo. They promised to investigate, but I could see the unease in their eyes. For now I've moved to a new place, far from the haunting memories of that night, but the fear remains, creeping into the corners of my mind. Every time I hear a knock or catch a stranger's stare, my heart races. I've learned one thing: some connections are best left missed. It was the kind of quiet morning that made you feel like everything was just routine. The store was still dark when I arrived, the only sound being the occasional hum of the mall's ventilation system. As I unlocked the doors and flipped on the lights, a faint unease crept up my spine, but I brushed it off. After all, this was my first job, just a part-time gig to help pay for college. What could possibly go wrong in a busy mall surrounded by people? I was 18, fresh out of high school and eager to prove myself. I started the day like any other, tidying the shelves, turning on the register, and replying to overnight emails. Customers began trickling in as the morning wore on. It was business as usual, helping people find items, smiling politely and ringing up their purchases. Around midday, a man came in, looking slightly out of place. He was middle-aged, with a worn look about him, carrying a shopping list that seemed more like an afterthought. "Hi, can I help you find something?" I asked, keeping my tone bright and professional. His eyes lit up. "Yes, actually, I'm shopping for my daughter's birthday. Could you help me pick out a few things?" I nodded, walking him through the aisles. He asked a lot of questions, more than most customers, but I figured he was just one of those indecisive dads trying to do something nice for his kid. When we got to the register, he made a little joke about how his daughter would probably like the gift more if it came with a receipt for a refund. I laughed politely, handed him his bag, and thought nothing more of it. By the time my shift ended, the interaction was all but forgotten. I clocked out, headed to my college classes, and continued with my day. But a few days later, everything changed. I was out at a restaurant with my boyfriend, enjoying a rare moment of relaxation, when my phone started buzzing. My work group chat had exploded with notifications. Curious, I opened the chat and saw a screenshot someone had posted. It was a CRAIGSLIST ad. The title read, "Missed Connection, the girl from the store." My stomach dropped. I opened the image, and there it was, a detailed description of me. Blonde, petite, friendly. The man described our encounter at the store down to the smallest details, like the color of my uniform and how I had smiled at him while scanning his items. He wrote about how polite I was, how he wished he'd had the courage to ask for my number, and how he hoped I'd see the post and contact him. I stared at the screen in disbelief, my boyfriend leaning over to read it as well. "Is this about you?" he asked, his voice tinged with concern. I nodded slowly, my mind racing. I replayed that shift in my head, trying to remember anything unusual about the man. But nothing had seemed off at the time. He had blended in like any other customer. For the next few weeks, paranoia set in. Every time I worked, I felt like I was being watched. I stopped wearing my name tag, hoping to make myself less identifiable. I told my co-workers not to share my schedule with anyone, even if they seemed trustworthy. I started checking over my shoulder when I walked to my car after closing shifts. One afternoon, while I was restocking shelves, I thought I saw someone lingering near the store entrance. My heart skipped a beat, but when I looked again, they were gone. Later that day, a co-worker told me a man had been asking for me by name earlier, but she had told him I wasn't in. The feeling of being hunted was suffocating. The final straw came when another CRAIGSLIST post appeared. This time it was more direct. The man wrote that he'd been visiting the mall every day, hoping to run into me. He described watching me from a distance, admiring how I moved around the store. The thought of him lurking nearby made my skin crawl. I finally went to my manager and told her everything. She took it seriously, offering to adjust my schedule and have security walk me to my car. Still, the damage was done. My sense of safety was shattered, and I couldn't shake the feeling that he was always one step behind me. To this day, I don't know if he ever stopped looking for me. I left that job not long after and made sure my next one had stricter security measures. I still think about how ordinary that day had seemed, how easy it was for someone to slip through the cracks of normalcy and turn something as mundane as a customer interaction into something sinister. Now, every time I step into a public place, I'm on edge, scanning faces, wondering if he's still out there, watching, waiting. The air was heavy that evening, like the world itself held its breath in anticipation. The pediatrician's office stood at the edge of a newly paved road, surrounded by an eerie silence. The quietness of the location, paired with the faint buzz of the fluorescent lights above the parking lot, gave the place an unsettling atmosphere. It felt like the kind of silence that carried secrets, ones you didn't want to uncover. I was a young mother, barely into my 30s, with 2 little ones depending on me. My life revolved around them, and their safety was always my priority. That day, I had driven my 1-year-old and 3-year-old to a routine checkup at the new pediatrician's office, located in an isolated part of Georgia. The new building was pristine, the kind of place that looked safe at first glance but carried an unexplainable unease. The parking lot was almost empty when we arrived, save for a few scattered cars. It was late afternoon, and the office staff had given us the last appointments of the day, knowing we lived an hour away. I stepped out of our black Jeep Cherokee and carried my kids inside, their laughter breaking the stillness for just a moment. The appointment went as expected, waiting, checkups, and small talk with the doctor. By the time we were done, the receptionist was locking the glass doors behind us, and the last of the other patients had already left. The once sparse parking lot was now completely deserted, with only my Jeep left. I strapped my kids into their car seats, settled into the driver's seat, and turned the key. Click, click, click. The car refused to start. At first I thought it was just a hiccup. "Come on," I muttered, trying again. But the engine didn't respond. My heart sank. We were alone in an empty parking lot, miles from home, and the sun was already dipping below the horizon. I stepped out, scanning the area as the receptionist waved goodbye and disappeared into her car. The silence that followed was suffocating. Left with no choice, I knocked on the locked glass doors until someone let me back inside. Using the office phone, I called a nearby garage. A man answered and assured me he'd come to help, though he might take a while. Reluctantly, I thanked him and returned to the car with my kids. We waited as the building's lights flickered off one by one. By the time the last employee left, night had begun to settle in. I tried to keep the kids entertained, feeding them snacks and digging through my bag for toys, all while watching the road for the mechanic's arrival. That's when I saw it, a truck pulling into the lot. Relief washed over me as a man stepped out. He was scruffy and middle-aged, with a friendly smile that immediately put me at ease. "You called for help?" he asked. "Yes, thank you so much for coming," I replied, explaining the issue. He nodded and popped the hood, poking around as I sat back in the driver's seat. I waited for him to ask me to try the ignition, but he didn't. Instead, he mumbled something about a loose wire and kept tinkering. "You might want to take a look at this," he said after a few minutes, motioning for me to join him. I hesitated. "I wouldn't know what I'm looking at," I said with a nervous laugh, choosing to stay with my kids. His smile faltered slightly, but he didn't press the issue. "Suit yourself," he muttered and went back to work. Minutes turned into what felt like hours. He called me over twice more, each time growing increasingly insistent. I stayed put, my unease growing with every passing moment. Something about the way he worked, slow, deliberate, didn't sit right. Why wasn't he using jumper cables? And why did he keep asking me to leave the car? Then, without warning, another truck roared into the parking lot. The man under my hood froze, his head snapped toward the new arrival, and in an instant he slammed my hood shut and bolted to his vehicle. I barely had time to register what was happening. His tires screeched as he sped away, leaving me stunned and alone once more. The new truck parked beside me, and a man stepped out, his face illuminated by the dim overhead lights. He looked at me, then at the fleeing truck before approaching cautiously. "Ma'am, are you okay?" he asked, his voice steady and kind. "Yes, I think so," I stammered. "Are you the mechanic?" He nodded, confirming his name and mentioning the call I had made earlier. My breath caught in my throat as he gestured toward the road. "Who was that?" he asked. I thought it was you," I replied, my voice shaking. His expression darkened as he opened my hood and got to work, this time with the efficiency I'd expected from the start. Within minutes the engine roared to life and I felt a wave of relief. But then he paused, his hand holding something long and sharp. "Ma'am," he said, his voice low and serious, "is this yours?" In his hand was a thin, dagger-like tool, almost 1.5 feet long. Its blade gleamed, and small round finger holes on one end gave it a sinister appearance. "No," I whispered, staring at the object. He studied it for a moment, then looked back at me, his face pale. "This was under your hood," he said slowly, "right on top, like someone had just placed it there." I felt a chill run down my spine. The tool looked old, but the blade was unnervingly sharp. "I don't know what was about to happen here," he added, his voice barely above a whisper, "but I'm really glad I showed up when I did." I nodded, unable to speak, and handed him the payment. He gave me one last warning. "You should call the police when you get home."